In this video, I would like to discuss with you some basics of weight loss using lifestyle methods, such as caloric restriction and exercise. And we'll first look into the very concept of caloric restriction to understand what it is and how we calculate such caloric restriction. Then we'll discuss how sustainable caloric deficit translates into the rate and magnitude of weight reduction. Essentially, how much weight we're expecting to lose with a daily 500 to 700 calorie deficit, because this is what most people can maintain for a prolonged period of time. And then we'll tap into the somewhat frustrating topic of weight loss plateau, which is the situation when we enter caloric restriction, everything is going well, weight is dropping, and then with you being diligent in following nutrition and exercise plan to the letter, the trend just slows down. We'll discuss why this is happening and how we can practically address that. Let's start with clarifying what we mean by caloric deficit, how we quantify it, and on what assumptions we base our predictions for weight loss. Calories, or rather kilocalories, are units of energy. In the context of our body, we consume calories with food and caloric beverages, which we sometimes call calories in, and we expend or burn calories in a few different ways. And this calories outside of the equation, or as we sometimes call it, total daily energy expenditure, we have the whole four players here: BMR, TEF, eat and eat. The first way we expend calories is basal metabolic rate. It's a specific proportion of calories that we need to spend on baseline physiology. And most often it is quantified by using prediction equations, and these equations estimate body calorie needs based on sex, weight, height, and age. But in reality, in addition to these, BMR also depends on other factors such as body composition. Someone who's more muscular will have higher BMR because their muscle is burning more calories at rest. It also depends on genetics, hormonal status, for example, thyroid function, and environmental conditions, for example, ambient temperature. And it also may change with stress levels and certain diseases. So it is not simple to quantify BMR accurately. We can do that in a clinical setting using indirect calorimetry, which measures oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production, but in daily use, for simplicity, we stick with prediction equations. The second component of calories out is thermic effect of food, or TEF. And sometimes you'll also hear it called diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is essentially the energy cost of digesting, absorbing, transporting, and metabolizing nutrients. Because every time we eat, our body also invests energy to process the food consumed, and technically part of the caloric intake will be lost for or into that process. On average, fat has the lowest thermic effect of food, which is 0 to 3%, carbs somewhere between 5 and 10%, and protein has the highest thermic effect of food of 20 to 30%, which means that 20 to 30% of protein calories are spent on its digestion. So putting all these TEF values together in a simplified way, we usually assume that for mixed meals, typically 10% of daily calorie intake will be spent on the food processing. For example, if somebody eats 2000 calories a day on a mixed balanced diet, the TEF will account for about 200 calories. But in reality, this may vary significantly with diet composition. For example, someone on the ketogenic diet, the TEF will be much smaller because we've just mentioned it is 0 to 3% for fat versus 20 to 30% for protein. It will also vary with meal size, meal timing, and individual metabolic differences. And most calorie trackers and nutritionists usually do not take TEF into account. It can be measured, again, with indirect calorimetry, the same method that we use for measuring BMR in the lab setting, but oftentimes in real life it's just ignored. And the remaining two components of our calories out pot are eat and eat, which refers to exercise activity thermogenesis, that is exercise, because obviously when we exercise we burn calories, and non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT. And this NEAT is really important in the context of today's discussion, as we will see that this is one of the components of caloric equation that changes significantly as we progress with weight loss, and it is also one of the key elements to address weight loss plateaus when they happen. So non-exercise activity can be spontaneous and subconscious, like fidgeting, shifting posture, and minor movements that are largely outside our conscious control, but also all the low-intensity movements that we consciously choose to make throughout the day and that are not formal exercise, like walking or taking stairs. They also belong to this NEAT category. Can we quantify eat and NEAT? Yes, we can, but usually the accuracy of these calculations is quite low. Exercise calorie expenditure is usually quantified via heart rate and motion analysis, and most of the time it is overestimated. And as regards NEAT, its objective quantification is difficult. For example, if you're using activity tracker, it may track the part of NEAT which is your conscious low-intensity movement, for example, when you're walking. And oftentimes, again, as with exercise expenditure, this may be overestimated. And as regards spontaneous subconscious NEAT, like the energy expended during fidgeting or with posture changes, indirectly quantifying that with the use of motion sensors is possible, but it's usually of little practical application. And this actually may have a significant meaning for the calorie balance, because if we compare two people, like person A is really calm, can sit in one posture for hours, and doesn't really move about much, doesn't fidget at all, for that person, both conscious and subconscious NEAT calorie expenditure will be very low. And then at the same time, we have person B who's constantly on the move, who's hovering around the house, around the workplace, up and down the stairs rather than taking a lift. So in addition to all that, he's fidgeting all the time and can't sit still, changing the posture every 2 minutes. These two people can have an energy expenditure difference up to 1,000 or 1,500 calories just because of the dramatic difference in NEAT. So let's recap all that. Our calories in come from food and caloric beverages, and quantifying them is relatively simple. We just weigh our food, put this information in the calorie tracker, we're good. And our total daily energy expenditure, or calories out, is formed by basal metabolic rate, BMR, which we estimate with prediction equations, thermic effect of food, which we oftentimes ignore, subconscious and conscious NEAT, which is difficult to objectively quantify, and exercise expenditure, which is oftentimes overestimated. So the difference between calories in and calories out is our net calorie balance. And it may be zero, which means we consume as much as we spend. It may be positive, which means we consume more than we burn, and this excess energy will be stored primarily as fat within the adipose tissue. Or it may be negative, meaning that we are in caloric deficit, having consumed less energy than we have used. And in the latter case, we shall be losing weight. Now, an important question: how much weight we can realistically expect to lose? And before I give you the numbers, let's tap into the very important concept. Our weight is a compounding value that incorporates bone mass, lean mass, which includes muscle and organ tissues, and fat mass. And when we're talking weight loss, we're probably not meaning, oh, I'm going to lose some bone mass now, make my bones a bit more brittle and increase my risk of fractures, but the number of the scale will be a bit less, so I'll be happy with that. At the same time, we're also not implying losing muscle, because muscle is one of the most important longevity organs in our body. So eventually, when we say weight loss, we assume or imply fat loss, which is exactly the tissue which mass we want to reduce. So whenever we embark on a weight loss journey, we should be thinking body recomposition, and we should be actively promoting muscle growth with adequate protein intake and resistance training, and along with that, our bone health and bone mineral density will also improve, while at the same time, caloric deficit with adequate protein intake will be ultimately targeting fat loss. So now when we are all on the same page with regards to what it is actually we're going to lose, the adipose tissue, let's see how much of it we can get rid of with caloric deficit and what these calculations are based on. Firstly, let's start with understanding that adipose tissue is not pure fat. About 80 to 87% of adipose tissue is indeed composed of adipocytes or fat cells, but the remaining is formed of water, protein, and cellular material. So in reality, 1 kilogram of adipose tissue will contain around 850 grams of fat on average. I'm sure you all know that fat provides roughly 9 calories per gram, so if we think about the total energy content of 1 kilogram of body fat, it will be approximately 7,700 calories. And this number, 7,700 calories per kilogram body fat, is the foundation for most weight loss calculations. Now let's do some calorie-based maths together. If every day we create 500 calorie deficit, we have minus 3,500 per week, and that translates to roughly 1 pound or 450 grams of fat loss per week. If we create a larger deficit of 700 calories per day, this is roughly 4,900 calories per week, and we would expect losing 600 to 700 grams of fat per week or 1.4 pounds. So in a perspective of 1 month, we are looking at roughly 4 to 6 pounds or 2 to 3 kilos. And in the annual perspective, we could expect 52 to 73 pounds or 24 to 33 kilograms. It is important to know that even in the very beginning, the weight loss is not linear. And when put on the graph, we rather see a seesaw around some imagined downgoing line than a straight line. But over the first 3 to 6 months of caloric restriction, weight loss may be reasonably steady and may result in 5 to 10% body weight reduction. And this usually brings meaningful metabolic and cardiovascular improvements already. In my work with clients, I always emphasize and distinguish between the so-called plateau illusion and the true weight loss plateau. Plateau illusion is a situation when you're in a caloric restriction coupled with adequate resistance training and protein intake, so your fat tissue mass is reducing, but at the same time your muscle mass is increasing. And that is why your weight loss is not as quick as you would probably expect it to be, but it's actually normal. It's a beneficial situation for health and longevity in general, although the weight loss is slightly less prominent. But because our scales cannot distinguish between fat and muscle, it's only if you do DEXA scan during your weight loss journey, for example every 3 to 6 months, only then you will objectively see how much fat you've lost and how much muscle mass you have gained in response to your effort. And in contrast with plateau illusion, the true plateau usually develops sometime after 6 months, maybe earlier, maybe later, maybe even after 1 or 2 years. And this is when the weight may become stagnant for some time, irrespective of your continuing effort. If we look at the weight loss from evolutionary perspective, this is a process that our body is trying to defend from and stop, because as the body is actively losing fat tissue, it gets the impression of becoming closer and closer to dying. And this is why our body deploys a whole complex of adaptation mechanisms that aim to reduce energy expenditure and promote appetite, hunger, and weight regain. If we look at the total daily energy expenditure, we will see that all 4 components of it, BMR, TEF, eat and NEAT, will be affected by this metabolic adaptation. Basal metabolic rate will decrease, not only because body mass is decreasing, and we remember that one of the BMR determinants is body weight and height, but also because our organs and cells become more metabolically efficient. And the studies show that BMR may drop by 10 to 15%, which is a serious number. Thermic effect of food will also decrease, and that's natural. We consume less food, so we end up spending less energy on its processing. Now, going further, you remember that we had these 2 components to activity thermogenesis. We had EAT and NEAT, exercise and non-exercise activity. So what happens with exercise spending? Turns out that if we maintain our exercise activity at the same level without much of a progression, then along with the weight loss, our muscles become more efficient and they require less ATP, less energy, which means fewer calories to perform the same amount of exercise. So with a constant training program, we'll be burning less calories the further we get with caloric restriction and weight loss. And with regards to NEAT, the non-exercise activity, we see that along with the weight loss, the person becomes more and more prone to idling. There's less subconscious spontaneous activity, less fidgeting, less posture change, more sitting, less moving about. So our NEAT expenditure drops dramatically. In addition to that, there are multiple hormonal changes that result in decreased satiety signaling, increased hunger signaling, as well as reduced metabolic activity. Essentially, as the result of all this adaptation with prolonged caloric restriction, our body is spending less calories. And that means that if we are in a constant caloric restriction of 500 or 700 calories per day, our true deficit may shrink down to 200 or maybe even disappear as a result of all this adaptation. And this is why instead of continuing weight loss, we end up with a plateau. But many people think, oh, I've hit the plateau, this is something bad. No, that's not something bad or unexpected. It's a natural physiology that we should anticipate. Now let's see how we can counter those adaptation mechanisms and by what practical tools so that we continue losing weight with caloric restriction. The first strategy to use to leverage through the weight loss plateau relates to boosting different types of exercise activity. And here we have 3 tools that will help increase energy expenditure while delivering additional health and longevity benefits. If you recall the total daily expenditure components, we had exercise activity and non-exercise activity. So exercise activity we can boost in 2 ways. Firstly, by regular progressive resistance training coupled with adequate protein intake and recovery. And this will not only preserve and augment lean mass, which will ultimately increase your BMR, basal metabolic rate, but you will also spend calories during the exercise session. So you tick the boxes for both BMR and EAT increases with resistance training. Secondly, we can boost exercise activity by increasing the volume of zone 2 aerobic training. This is the type of training when we exercise for a prolonged period of time at the rate of perceived exertion of 4 out of 10 roughly, and with heart rate of 60 to 75% of maximum. And it could be treadmill, walking, cycling, running, and so on. And the beauty of this type of training, particularly in the context of weight loss and caloric restriction, is that it is not particularly demanding. And as a result, we can exercise for prolonged sessions, 45, 60, maybe 90 minutes, and this way we achieve notable energy expenditure. And at the same time, given the RPE, the rate of perceived exertion, is in the realms of 4 out of 10, we will get minimal systemic fatigue and much less pronounced cortisol response. So we get pretty high caloric output with relatively minimized systemic stress. And when we're talking zone 2 training, our goal should be not to exhaust ourselves, but to accumulate sufficient time in this optimal metabolic zone. And we are talking 2 to 4 sessions of 45, 60, maybe 90 minutes per week, with ideal weekly total of 180 minutes or more. Now let's move to the third tool of the exercise strategy, the NEAT. You remember that there were 2 components to it. One was that subconscious and spontaneous, like fidgeting and posture change, but there was also a conscious component. And while we can't command ourselves to fidget, we can still affect our conscious NEAT component by choosing to move more, by paying attention to our behavior, if we become stagnant, if we're getting more and more sedentary, and by getting regular walks, by taking stairs instead of the lift, by going to the supermarket on foot, by pacing during the phone calls, and so on. Even standing during work, when you're combining sitting and standing work, for example, in 1-to-1 ratio, this will incur notable caloric expenditure over the course of time, as opposed to just sitting at work. And the studies show that if we compare a sedentary office worker with a person with physically active occupation like a farmer or server, their NEAT may differ by up to 1,500 calories per day, which is a huge difference. So if you are stuck with a weight loss plateau, definitely deploy exercise as your mighty first lever by increasing your resistance training volume, your zone 2 training, by paying attention to your conscious need and choosing to move more. The second strategy that will help you break through the weight loss plateau relates to caloric periodization. Essentially, it means strategically planned phasing of caloric deficit and caloric maintenance within your nutritional plan. For example, you plan a 4-week cycle and you have 3 weeks of 700 per day calorie deficit, and then you have a week 4 when you go zero deficit and consume your calories at maintenance level. Such periodization will allow metabolic recovery and will attenuate adaptation responses and help improve physiological adherence in the long term. But we must appreciate that when the person goes into that 4th week or whatever week that will be within your plan, which is your isocaloric week, there should not be any consumption of fast and junk food. These extra calories must be coming from healthy whole foods. And the third strategy to allow us to break through the weight loss plateau is essentially to make sure we keep all our basics right. Get 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep every night. This will reduce ghrelin levels that trigger hunger and increase leptin levels that trigger satiety. Deploy stress management in the shape or color you prefer, from reading books, sitting at the fireplace, to meditation and more. Chronic stress results in chronic cortisol elevation, which in turn promotes fat storage, especially in the form of visceral fat. So if you're doing your best with caloric restriction and exercise, but at the same time your sleep is rubbish and you're totally stressed all the time, your chances of success with weight loss are diminishing. Also, make sure you get sufficient micronutrients like vitamins D and B, magnesium and iron to sustain energy and metabolism, and also that you get enough water and fiber-rich foods to support your digestion, increase satiety, and ensure gut hormone and microbiome balance. And last but not least, make sure you're meticulous with your food logging so that you don't get any unnoticed calorie intake sneaking in. So if you're doing everything right with caloric restriction and exercise, and you're losing weight successfully for some time, but then you bump against the plateau, just don't get frustrated, don't get upset. Recognize that this is a normal physiological checkpoint and apply exercise, caloric periodization, and foundational levers that will get you back on track with your weight loss. And ideally, that's fat loss, not the loss of muscle and bone. And remember, sustainable fat loss is the result of consistent, moderate deficits, your precision, your patience, and respect for your own body physiology. If you found this valuable, feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more evidence-based content. And I see you again soon in the next video.